Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 10th annual Michael E. DeBakey Grand Rounds. Just a few things that I need to announce. Surveys are being passed out, and completion of the surveys is very important for our CME accreditation, so please take a minute after the lecture to finish them. We are videotaping this. We're having live streaming. We're actually on Facebook, believe it or not. And later we'll be on YouTube as well. And so a lot of new technology, which I'm sure Dr. DeBakey would approve of. During the Q&A session, please ask for a microphone as we're recording this, and it's difficult to hear in the background to record the questions. It's extreme privilege and a pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Richard Dick Wainerdi, who is going to present the 10th annual Michael E. DeBakey Lecture. Dick originally came from New York City in the Bronx, I believe, and he began a slow westward migration. He received his master's and PhD from Penn State in nuclear engineering. And in the late 1950s, he moved westward again and studied petroleum engineering at the University of Oklahoma. Then he joined the faculty of one of our beloved schools, Texas A&M, and founded their Nuclear Science Center. And he served as professor and later vice president for academic affairs. In 1984, his career took a rather interesting turn. He became the CEO, COO, and president of the Texas Medical Center here in Houston, Texas. So for almost 3 decades, he shepherded the growth of the TMC, which tripled in size during his tenure. Dr. Wainerdi was honored by the TMC with the naming of this bridge over Bray's Bayou on Cambridge Street. How many famous people do you know have a bridge named after them while they're still alive? Not many. This idea was actually generated by our own beloved David Underwood. Dr. Wainerdi was close friends with Dr. Michael DeBakey, traveled all over the United States and the world with him, and because of their close relationship, I've asked him to deliver today's lecture. Please give a warm Methodist welcome to Dr. Dick Wainerdi.
Thank you very much, and I particularly want to thank the DeBakey family for giving me the honor of letting me speak about my good and dear friend, Dr. Michael E. DeBakey. I'm going to talk to you today about the Texas Medical Center, how it got to be here, tell you a little bit about Dr. DeBakey's interactions with me, and also I'm going to talk a little bit about the Methodist Hospital and a lot of its history and what really came to be, as you know, one of the great healthcare complexes in the world. The Texas Medical Center was made possible by a man who died before the idea was conceived. And that man was Monroe Dunaway Anderson. Mr. Anderson was in the cotton trading business between the port of Galveston and England. He made a great deal of money, but he never married, never bought a house. Until the last 6 months of his life, he didn't own a car. But he left an estate which consisted of a steamer trunk of clothes and $19 million in 1939, which is about the same as $200 million today. Because he had no children, and because his nephews and others were well enough off, he left the money to a foundation called the M.D. Anderson Foundation, which is still working today. And the Anderson Foundation consisted of 3 people. One was Colonel Bates, who's famous for not only being one of the founders of the Texas Medical Center, but of the University of Houston, of the Houston Ship Canal, and many things that Colonel Bates, by the way, he's an honorary colonel, he really wasn't a military colonel, and a banker named Wilkins, Horace Wilkins, and John Freeman, a lawyer. The three of them happened to have the same doctor, and the doctor was Ernst William Bertner. Dr. Bertner was born in Colorado City, Texas. Now, for those of you who are not from Texas, that really is the way you pronounce it. And he went to school at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. And then he went off to World War I and became a surgeon on the staff of General Pershing. When the war was over and he came back to Houston, there was not a single board-certified physician in this county. And the people of means who could went to the east for their care, and he felt that not to be appropriate. So he decided to work on these three patients of his. And as all of you know, who are either physicians or patients, there's certain times in which a physician has a great deal of influence over a patient, and he talked to them about an idea he had. Now, he was moving up in power, and he had become the chief of medical staff at the Herman Hospital. The Herman Hospital, now called Memorial Herman, was much smaller and located where it is, way in the outskirts of Houston. Fannin Street was paved with oyster shells. And Dr. Bertner would look out of the window of his office at Herman Hospital and see a swamp full of mosquitoes and animals running around, all kinds of things, but no sign of life except across Main Street, there was a little school called Rice Institute, which was trying to get itself moving. But this was far out of town. So he kept talking to these three and goading them to use some of the money in the Anderson estate to build a medical center. Well, in her 90s, I visited with Mrs. Bates, and she told me that she was responsible for the Texas Medical Center. And I said, Mrs. Bates, I don't understand that. She said, well, the boys were in my living room smoking cigars and stinking up the house. So I threw them out of the house and put them out on the porch. And that's where they agreed to follow up with Dr. Bertner's idea. She said, if I hadn't thrown them out, you wouldn't have medical. So I said, thank you so much. She was in her 90s at that time. Well, the idea that Dr. Bertner had was that a plot of land would be assembled next to the Herman Hospital, and that a whole bunch of competing institutions would be attracted to come there, but it would have basically as its goals research, education, humane patient care, and the prevention of disease and injury. And that by being together, they could do certain common things together and enrich each other. Now, this may sound like a fairly simple, why would anybody get this idea? But this, as you will see, came out to be fairly unique in the whole world. Well, anyway, if you're going to have a medical center, you better have something there. You had Herman already, but at that time, there was a bill in the Texas legislature to found a hospital for the criminally insane and people who had cancer. One hospital. Now, the reason for that was that at that time, it was shameful to have cancer. You just didn't talk about it. It was sort of swept away. Well, Dr. Bertner didn't think that was a very good idea, putting those two together. And so he and the trustees of the Anderson Foundation convinced, working with the University of Texas, convinced the legislature to build two hospitals. One for the criminally insane was built in Rusk, Texas. We now call it mental illness, and that's where that still is. The other hospital was to be built in any city of Texas, which would provide land and money to match the state's money. Just right for the Anderson Foundation. But they didn't have any land. So they went to the city of Houston and said they would like to buy 134 acres adjacent to the Herman Hospital. It was city land, not parkland, city land. People sometimes think it's the other, but it was city land. Now, in order to buy city land at that size and at that time, you had to have a bond election. And they had an election in Houston, Texas, in which 940 people voted. Smallest turnout they've ever had an election, and it carried the day. The city was allowed to sell the land to the trustees, to the MD Anderson Foundation for 134 acres for $3,000 an acre. We now have land across the street from the Texas Medical Center, which is almost $1,000 a foot. So times have changed. But anyway, they now had this 134-acre swamp, and it was really dodgy as to what would happen. Yes, they were going to have a hospital for cancer, and the problem with having a hospital at that time was, in Texas, the only things that are permanent, that last forever, are the state universities. So they decided to go to the University of Texas and make it a part of the University of Texas. And the first sign said, the University of Texas, MD Anderson Cancer Hospital and Tumor Institute, little letters. Now, as you know, the sign says, the University of Texas in little letters and MD Anderson in very big letters. Times have changed. Then the idea was to get a medical school. Well, there was a medical school that was part of Baylor University that was up in Dallas. And they really weren't getting along very well. There were people in Dallas circles that, for one reason or another, weren't supporting that medical school the way they thought they ought to be supported. So the trustees and a few others trekked up to Dallas and basically bought a medical school. Said, come to Houston, we'll give you funding, we'll give you land, and it'll just be wonderful. So Baylor, at that time University College of Medicine, came to Houston, stayed in an old Sears Roebuck store until they could build a building. And the building they built is still there. It's in Baylor Plaza, sort of across the street. And now we had a medical school, we had a couple of hospitals. And about that time, there was a hospital in Midtown called the Methodist Hospital. And it had about 80 beds, relatively small. And so they wanted to come out, and they were offered land and wanted to come out. And so they decided to come here and build a similar size hospital. And Mrs. Elefondrin, whose husband was one of the founders of Exxon, and who is the great patron of this institution, said, I will not give a dime unless it's a 300-bed hospital. So of course it was a 300-bed hospital. Next, the Episcopalians noticed that the Methodists were building a hospital. You know what comes next. A haberdasher, a banker, and a lawyer decided there needed to be a children's hospital, so they founded Texas Children's. I won't take you through 56 institutions, but the point is that once it started to take off, more and more institutions found that they were gaining things by getting, up until 1984, which was free land. We gave them free land. And we gave them money from the foundation. In 1984, we had to make a change because the city of Houston, which had promised us with all kinds of contracts and agreements and everything, that they would put the city health department here and never move it. One day, the mayor called me up and said, she's moving it somewhere else. She's moving it out. I said, Mayor, we have documents, we have agreements, the city council has voted. She said, we are a sovereign city, and there's nothing you can do about it. So what we did, they moved. What we did is we changed the rules. Now anybody, after 1984, Anybody who gets land has to get it through a lease, very expensive lease. It's $1 a year for 99 years, renewable for another 99 years. Every time I gave land to Mark Wallace at Children's, he would hand me the check immediately. I said, Mark, let's string this out a little bit. But anyway, many of our institutions have gotten their land what's called fee simple, that is, without any leasing or anything. And Methodist Hospital land is one of those that came before 1984. So the land you are sitting on right now was given to Methodist Hospital for nothing by the Texas Medical Center Corporation, which had evolved from the Anderson Foundation. The Anderson Foundation spun it off into its own entity, and the first president of the Texas Medical Center was Dr. Ernst William Berkner. He doubled at that time as president of MD Anderson, first president of MD Anderson. What they were starting to see, and it's in the bylaws and constitution of the medical center, that there's some things we just can do together. The infrastructure, all the roads and utilities and all the things that make basically what's a private city work. Today, the Texas Medical Center is the 10th largest downtown in the United States. It has approximately 50 million square feet. And it is larger than the downtowns of Austin, El Paso, and Fort Worth put together. So it's really like a city, and basically the corporation, Texas Medical Center Corporation, of which I was president, serves really as the manager of a private city. Now, that's one of its jobs. It has a lot of other jobs, but that's one of them. When we were just before this meeting, somebody mentioned something about parking. Well, the first parking garage, Garage 1, that's the first garage ever built. And it was paid for by Methodist, Luke's, and Children's. And they fought incessantly about that project. And finally, they just said, we're giving it to the Texas Medical Center. You guys make it work. And after that, the Texas Medical Center has built 20 garages and runs, with the institutions, one of the largest parking operations in the world. We park more cars than O'Hare Airport in the Texas Medical Center, about 89,000 a day. Now, I know some of you are saying, but we can't find a spot. Part of the problem is we have grown so remarkably large. I mean, in order for you to appreciate the growth, even in the 30 years I was president, is that Methodist Hospital was what is now the center building. And on the front of it has beautiful tile picture of Jesus welcoming the hordes and so forth. But if you go in the Crane Garden to the information desk right near where people come in, you'll see a small replica of that in tile. And unfortunately, the real facade is covered now. Anyway, the medical center is really unusual. And I talked often to Dr. DeBakey about whether there's anything like it in the field of medicine, anything that's large, complex, and also composed of institutions which compete with each other in a lot of ways, but cooperate with each other in a lot of ways. And that has an organization held together somewhat voluntarily, but somewhat not voluntarily, because when Methodist and each of the institutions accepted the land, they agreed to certain covenants and agreements. And that was that, for example, they must always be nonprofit. They must always agree to work together in certain fields, and I'll mention those a little later. At the beginning, the dream was that we would have one pathology department for everybody. That lasted about a week and a half, and we decided that wasn't too good. But we thought maybe we could have a laundry and share a laundry. Texas Medical Center laundry is one of the largest in the world. And some of the institutions chose to have their own. That was perfectly fine. But a lot of them chose to use this, and the Texas Medical Center laundry serves most of the hospitals from here to Louisiana. So another thing we decided to do was to have a central plant to make chilled water. We call it the Thermal Energy Cooperative, or TECO. TECO produces almost 140,000 tons of chilled water. Now, let me put that in perspective. The Pentagon uses about 40,000. So when you add in the chilled water produced by the plant at Methodist, which is a little bit smaller, one at Baylor, another one at the VA, add it all up, and it's about 160,000 tons. Your home probably has 5 or 10 or 12 or something. But that number is so large that we have chilled water running around here in pipes that are 6 feet in diameter. And during the 40 years since, now it's getting closer to 50 years, the TECO has been serving the institutions. And by the way, the new building of Methodist is served by TECO. During that time, they've been down 4 hours total. And that was close to the beginning. During hurricanes and storms and whatever, they keep operating. The problem is, even though they keep operating, during things like Tropical Storm Allison, we had no electricity. And if you have no electricity, you don't have the fans to blow over the chilled water to cool the buildings. So we had problems at that time, and one of my dreams, which I did not get to fulfill, was to do the same thing with electricity that we had done with TECO, with the chilled water, and that is to make our own electrical generation plants and do it ourselves. Not that it isn't good to be on the grid, but the problem with the grid, or any other way you get electricity, is while we are number one in demand and that they'll take everybody off first, that doesn't mean the grid can't fail. And if the grid were to fail, it'll take 2 or 3 weeks to bring it up. We just couldn't live like that. These buildings are sealed. In the summer, they get up to 130, 140 degrees if you don't air condition them. So this has been a problem and something we worried about. Another big problem we worried about was flooding. We had a giant flood in 1972. We had another giant flood in 1978. And then in 2001, in June, came Tropical Storm Allison. We were assured by all the TV weathercasters, don't worry about nothing, please, just nothing. So we got 12 inches of rain in 4 hours, and we had 6 feet of water throughout the Texas Medical Center, everywhere, 6 feet of water. The underpasses on Holcomb were all full of water, and it was truly terrible. During that period in Allison is when we learned to come together really. We couldn't leave, we couldn't get people in, but we had ways to give to each other things that were needed. And we also came up with, at that time, the idea we didn't ever want to flood again. Now, one of the reasons we had flooded is there used to be 7 giant pumps taking water out of Herman Park. And the Texas Medical Center and Rice had gone down 5 feet from that water being taken out. You can never pump it up again. So the county formed a commission, an actual authority to deal with subsidence. And since that happened right after Allison, we have had less than 1/4 of an inch subsidence, but the damage is done. We're at the bottom of a teacup. Now, most people think that the water, when we flood, comes from Brays Bayou. It does not come from Brays Bayou. The water, when we flood, comes from West Houston. We drain 3,400 acres over land into the Rice and into the medical center. And we knew we had to do something about that. So we got after Allison, we got through help from the federal, state, and local governments and ourselves. And by the way, Methodist was very helpful in that sponsoring that work. We got $100 million together to build bypasses on Kirby, on Herman Drive, and on what used to be called Outer Belt, and now is called Cambridge. And those bypasses take the water that's coming over land and put it in the bayou. Each of the institutions, which suffered hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage. Methodist, it was astonishing how much damage was done. Labs, everything you can imagine, equipment, everything you can imagine. This time, it did not happen when we had Hurricane Harvey. And the reason that didn't happen was not only that we took care of the overland water, but we added submarine doors, we added all kinds of things. And we have special precautions now for those people institutions which are on the tunnel. We laughingly call it tunnel dwellers, but that's Methodist and Luke's and Children's. That tunnel, by the way, used to go all the way over to Herman, but after one of the floods, they decided they wanted to block off the tunnel and keep the water out of their place. Now, one of the interesting things about the medical center that really has been a blessing is that we have been honored by having so many leaders here who have not only led in medicine, but led in diplomacy, in international affairs, in innovation, in whatever you can imagine. Certainly the foremost of those has been Dr. DeBakey. But also there have been others, like Arlie Clark at MD Anderson, and Ralph Feigen at Texas Children's, Dr. Cooley at St. Luke's. And in a way, those leaders were very fortunate to have on the boards of directors people like David Underwood and other community leaders. And by the way, we have now about 1,300 directors of our institutions. And almost without exception, they're community leaders, philanthropists, people of great interest. So when I first came, I brought all of these people together. Tony Gatto helped me, Dr. DeBakey helped me. We brought everybody together. And we said, what do we want the Texas Medical Center to be? What is our dream of, by this time, the users? And they were very helpful. They said, there's so many things we could do together without hurting our competition or anything like that. And so we started out forming a whole bunch of councils. And one of the ones that was most effective is the Council of CEOs. And this was composed of the CEOs of the largest institutions and representative CEOs of the middle-sized and small institutions. And we met once a month for lunch, and the rule was you could say whatever you want, don't hit each other, but basically, let's put everything on the table, whatever it is. And there were some things that were very tender, because some of the people felt that some of their stars had been whisked away with a better offer or something. And there were other issues that had to be dealt with. And when we really looked at how we could do these things, lots of things came clear. In addition to the CEO councils, we had a council of nurse executives headed by Ann Scanlon McGinnity, who's from Methodist, still at Methodist. And what they came up with is a council to include all the chief nursing officers, all the deans of the nursing schools, and representatives of the state, which supports nursing education, and tried to figure out, this is remembered a time when nursing education was changing dramatically. And they worked on how nurses could become administrators, how they could figure out what their place is in the whole arena of healthcare, and it was a very effective council. It's still in operation. Another one was the Council of Pharmacy Executives. And they sat down and they asked a question. Why do all of our institutions keep all of the rare drugs? Well, because it's a regulatory requirement. So we went to the regulators and we said, look, we can get them in 5 minutes. Do we all have to keep all of them? And they said, no, it's perfectly reasonable if you have them and you're willing to give them as they're needed. This saved us, at the time, a little over $2 million a year. But the main issue was not that we just were together on how to deal with something like rare drugs, but at that time, people were stealing Procrit. Now they're stealing other things. But in those days, the really valuable stuff, worth more at that time than platinum, was Procrit. And so all of the pharmacy directors got together and tried to figure out, how do we really keep up with medicines? And at that time, the institution that had the best system was the VA. Here, take it, we'll give you it. And their wristband, computers, all the stuff they had was used. So one of the things that I want to make sure you understand in all of this is that the Texas Medical Center exists and operates in an organization now of over 56 institutions, some of which you may not know of. I don't know how many of you know that the Menninger Clinic moved from Topeka to Houston under Dr. DeBakey's guidance. He and I met with Walter Menninger, who's the son of the founders, and Topeka was getting a little hard to reach and not really having all the assets they wanted. So they came to Houston, and they wanted to build a campus here, and they found 56 acres, no, 50 acres south of, on Main Street, and they asked me what I thought of that location. I said, I think it's terrible. It's the worst location I ever saw. Nothing's good about it. It's flat. Why would you want to be there? I said, well. So they brought in landscape people and made little mountains, little lakes, all kinds of stuff on their 50 acres. And then the architecture is Frank Lloyd Wright prairie architecture. It is gorgeous. And that is the Menninger Clinic, generally rated as one of the top 3 psychiatric operations in this country. And they gave the entire Menninger Psychiatric Library to our library. I should mention the Texas Medical Center Library is the 2nd largest medical library in the world after the National Library of Medicine. Anyway, one of the things that impressed me as all this is going on is that I constantly had availability of Dr. DeBakey's wisdom. We would meet on Wednesdays for blackened redfish. And when I say blackened, I don't mean like just ordinary blackened. I mean fiery blackened. And I was always embarrassed to tell him that I really didn't like it that much. But he was tolerant, and he always wanted me to call him Mike. And I just could not do that. I just never did. I called him Dr. DeBakey. And we had a lot of fun. For those of you who didn't get to know him or didn't spend much time with him, Dr. DeBakey was one of those very rare people who just sparkles all the time and had this ability, on whatever subject you want to talk about, to be wise. And I first met him when I was at Texas A&M. I ran the health programs up there. And I wanted to start a medical school. And I needed to figure out how would we do that? Because at the time, the coordinating board had just been formed, and they had a little meeting of Baylor and the people at Galveston and the people in Dallas, and they decided they really didn't want any more medical schools. Well, Texas Tech wanted one, and A&M wanted one. So Dr. DeBakey agreed to help me to do that. And so what we did, and we'd never done this before, is we made Dr. DeBakey Distinguished Professor of Surgery at the Texas A&M College of Medicine, which did not exist. And we also came up with an idea to do 2 years of basic sciences in College Station, and then 3 years here in Houston in clinical things. And that 2 and 3 plan had been in several places in the country where it was being done, in the Pacific Northwest, in Indiana, several places. You would go to your university for the 2 years, you'd go to the medical school, and 2 years after in the medical school, you'd get your bachelor's degree, and the next year, you would graduate with an MD. So a total of 5 years, which we all thought was a lot better than 8. And so it was accepted. I mean, this concept was accepted, and the idea was the students would have 2 years at Texas A&M and then 3 years at Baylor. The unfortunate part of that is that the LCME at the time, Liaison Committee on Medical Education, had at the time a leader who really wasn't happy with Dr. DeBakey. He had been let go at Baylor. He was in a very bad mood. And he said, as long as Dr. DeBakey's part of it, it's not going to happen. So what we did is to form the same kind of a thing, but with Scott and White. And, but we have revenge, because now the last 2 years of medical school is being done here at Methodist with Texas A&M. So things eventually come around and are good. As Dr. DeBakey and I started to work together and talk about things, it became clear that one of his great passions was veterinary medicine. He loved the idea that you could do really wonderful medical things with patients who couldn't talk to you. And so he was just fascinated. And one of the things that was in his mind is, how did a giraffe function? The head's so far up there, the heart's down here. How does it really work? So he decided we would get a giraffe. And in the veterinary school at A&M, we got a giraffe. Where it came from, I have no idea. And they put him in a room with padded 6 inches of foam all over the room so he wouldn't get hurt. And they had veterinary students petting him to keep him cool. I say him, may have been a girl, I don't know. But anyway, we're not allowed to do anything invasive. We couldn't hurt the giraffe. So what we did to try to figure out how this thing worked is we used the ultrasound. And Dr. DeBakey discovered that there were 2 pumps in the giraffe's neck, that the heart took it up to the first pump, muscle here took it up to the second pump, and into the head. And this is one of the reasons giraffes sleep standing up and almost never get down flat. But there are also other things he learned, is what happens when a giraffe puts his head down to eat grass, although notice that they really prefer leaves. How does that work? And he saw how there was a valve that stopped them. He was just thrilled with all of this. He then wanted to do tigers, and how could tigers run so fast? And we talked him out of that. Dr. DeBakey, giraffe is one thing. Let's not do a tiger. Another thing that, and by the way, I must say one thing about veterinary medicine. They basically teach 5 species to the students. And in a veterinary hospital, they do brain surgery on parakeets. And at ours, in College Station, people will bring kittens to the veterinary school to have them euthanized. Last thing the veterinary students are going to do, but they tell the people, your kitten is now in heaven. Now what that means is the kittens were taken to the dairy barns where there's milk and all the things that they want, and they're in kitten heaven. But no veterinary student euthanizes healthy animals. It does not happen any more than physicians euthanize healthy people. Dr. DeBakey also, as we as we worked together, came up with a number of really startling ideas. Not only did he come up with an idea for Medicare and write down a lot of the basics of Medicare, but he came up with the idea of the National Library of Medicine. He came up with Mary Lasker with the idea of the National Institutes of Health. Came up with the idea of MASH, the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. And during that, he did this during World War II. He was on the staff of the Surgeon General and of the Army. And Dr. DeBakey, when the war was over, when World War II was over, he stayed an extra year and asked his colleagues to stay an extra year to try to convert what was then a really moribund VA into something that could handle the enormous load as the military hospitals were closing. In Houston, there was a hospital, a naval hospital, and he asked President Truman to allow it to become a hospital for the VA. And he said he would do two things if this was granted. He would start a Dean's Committee, and the Dean's Committee would oversee the care in that hospital. Today, there is a Dean's Committee in every VA hospital. It was just his idea. But a World War II naval hospital is not particularly, well, it was a bunch of wooden shacks. I don't know how to put that better. And in front of it, they had an 18-hole golf course. So Dr. DeBakey decided that it'd be a good idea to build a hospital on that 18-hole golf course. The VA hospital, now called the Michael E. DeBakey VA Hospital, is the second largest federal structure after the Pentagon. The VA promised they would never build one that big again. It covers basically the golf course, and there are roads under it, by the way. And in the lobby of the hospital, as you enter the atrium of that hospital, there's a portrait which we had done of Dr. DeBakey. The medical center had it done with help from the institutions. And it's a picture of Dr. DeBakey receiving the Legion of Merit in the Army. And under the picture it says, Colonel Michael E. DeBakey, United States Army Medical Corps, surgeon, statesman, soldier. And everybody who comes into the VA hospital sees that picture. Dr. DeBakey has not only gotten the Congressional Gold Medal, not only has things all over the place, schools, DeBakey High School, all kinds of things named for him. He has left a legacy in the hearts of all of us who knew him. And each of us have different recollections. Each of us have different moments. But I particularly prize one that he told me about when he came home from taking care of Boris Yeltsin in Russia. When he went to Russia, they landed the airplane, and usually go in and do all the customs work. None of that. There were, they call their big limousines Zins, and they were waiting there, put him in one, took him to the Kremlin, and they have a hall called the Hall of Nuns, and it has around it all kinds of statuary. Largely buffet for one person. So he ate, he never eats on the plane, but he ate the buffet afterwards. And then he went to see President Yeltsin. And he said, Mr. President, with all due respect, you smoke and you drink, and I will not take care of you unless you stop smoking and drinking. And I will know, because I'm looking at your blood and I'm looking at you. And for the time that Dr. DeBakey took care of him, Boris Yeltsin stopped smoking and drinking. Dr. DeBakey was quite interested in how people's health was. And for all of us, his office was in the 9th floor of across the street. And when I would go there, he said, "How'd you get up here?" I said, "Well, I took the elevator." No, Dick, don't. You see, he's in his 90s. "Please, walk up the stairs. It's much better for you." So I didn't say anything, but of course I took the elevator. Sometimes in your life, you're allowed to have experiences and do things which just seem more than you should be allowed to witness. And one of those times was in 1990, we had in Houston the meeting of the heads of state and ministers, finance ministers and secretaries of state of all of the leading industrial countries. The meeting was held at Rice, but in the medical center here. And by the way, Rice is an institution of the medical center. But on this campus, we took care of the spouses in this room. And in this room, at that podium, Barbara Bush said to these guests who were about to leave on tours of all the institutions, "The Texas Medical Center is Houston's gift to the world." I've always felt that Dr. DeBakey was God's gift to the world. And I believe that wherever he is now, he still is conjuring up ideas, wanting to do things, anxious to start new projects, as he did for almost 100 years. Almost 100 years. And the day before he passed away, he asked me if I could do something for him. I said, "Sure, whatever you want. I want you to go around and talk to the transplant people at all the institutions." He said, "I am unsatisfied with the training program in transplant. And I want you to tell them that I care very much about them getting together and getting a world-class transplant training program in the Texas Medical Center." And I did that. I thank you very much, and be happy to answer any questions.
Dr. Wainerdi, thank you so much. That was an astonishing history of the Texas Medical Center and your relationship with Dr. DeBakey. Are there any questions? Certainly there's some questions in the audience. We have a microphone.
Wow.
Well, I have a question. Dr. Wainerdi, tell us your most memorable experience with Dr. DeBakey over the years that you all were colleagues.
Well, one that stands in my mind is that when the logistics team came from the White House to plan for the tours and all of the things for the summit, the 1990 summit of the industrialized nations, we met in Dr. DeBakey's office. And the window of his office looks out on MD Anderson. And after he had told us all of the wonders of Methodist and Baylor and all this, he took them over to the window and he said, "You must visit MD Anderson. It's wonderful." And after they left, I said, "Dr. DeBakey, you and Clark didn't get along. Well, why did you do that?" He said, "Dick, they are wonderful. And there's so many wonderful things here. We must always talk about the wonders of all of our colleagues." Great man.
Thank you. Well, if there are no questions, then, we have a question there.
Would you say a word about a project that I know is close to your heart, the Michael DeBakey High School for Health Professions?
The DeBakey High School used to be on the Leland Anderson campus, of course, 288. It just moved to the South Main campus in a brand-new facility. Dr. DeBakey conceived of the idea of having a high school for the most brilliant of students, but also from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all income levels. And so they started a high school on the Leland Anderson campus under the auspices of the Houston Independent School District. And if you have not been there, if you have not been in it, you might want to go into a high school that is completely silent. No running around, no screaming. Everybody is studying. They use the library of the Texas Medical Center, and 100% of the children go on to college, almost all with excellent scholarships. And in order to really appreciate, would go out there all the time, and the kids would flock around him and talk to him. But if sometime you're a little bit concerned about American education, you need to see what happens when you give kids 4 years of science, 4 years of math, all of the things, and I'm talking about a rainbow of kids. And we have had just incredible success. And one of the youngsters that particularly impressed us was a young lady named Precious. And Precious was, whenever the high school gives its little presentations, they always pick out a freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior who are ethnically different, gender different, whatever. So here Precious was making this presentation, and David Underwood was there. And David said, "Precious, where are you going to school?" She said, "Well, I just got into Yale." Now, David Underwood was a very big Yale guy. So Precious goes to Yale and becomes the president of the junior class and senior class at Yale, and then goes on to Yale Law School. And the next time David catches up with Precious, she's on the cover of the Yale Law Review and one of the editors. Then she goes into a very prestigious law firm, which the interesting thing is that she then went into health law. But a lot of our kids from DeBakey go into anything. Most of them go into healthcare. Lots of them go into medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, nursing. But some don't. But what Dr. DeBakey built there is the absolute model of how you can take any group of kids who are talented, but are from every background, and have them just shine. I was there one day when they were making a presentation to one of the foundations, and it was just mind-blowing. I mean, each of the kids would get up and say, "Well, I'm working over at Methodist Hospital in my spare time, and I'm in this lab working with so-and-so, and I'm doing this and that." And it was the Gates Foundation. And when the kids left, they said, "Well, what do they need? Well, what do you want? Do you have some particular need?" And Dr. DeBakey said, "We just want you to see this and try to replicate it." So we did. We have another school like the DeBakey down in the valley. But it's one of those wonderful things that he did. And there's so many more. Dennis, thank you. Dennis DeBakey, thank you.
Dr. Wainerdi, what influence do you see the Texas Medical Center has had on the medical community nationwide?
I think about that a lot, Bill, and I think one of the, I don't think it's had as much impact as it could, because I think right now medicine is in an enormous period of change. And I would have liked to see our leaders have the same kind of impact that Dr. DeBakey and others had in the past. I don't think we've kept up. When you see articles in JAMA and New England Journal and so forth on policy, you so rarely see our people. And so I think that in a way, the lessons we've learned and the way in which we do things is underwhelming right now, in my judgment. I think we could do a great deal more. There's a great battle going on now in medicine about those who wish to exploit for profit and commercial, and those who wish to practice medicine. And this is really something that needs to be a joined battle. It needs to be discussed. It needs to be debated. My heroes never cared for anything except taking care of people. And I always told people, if you're a doctor and you just don't want to spend all time taking care of sick people, you picked the wrong profession. If you came in to get rich in medicine, you made a sad mistake. And I think that's an area in which we could speak more. The other area is in research. And in education, we're getting new medical schools now all over the place. We need more fellowship slots, and we need more things. And I don't see the same attention that we used to have. A very active group of institutions in Austin and in Washington fighting for resources. I don't see that anymore. One or two of them are up there. But where we got power was we would bring the whole Texas delegation in. I know a lot of you have to go, but I've got to tell you a story along that line. NASA needed 6 votes to do the space station, 6. Dr. DeBakey asked me to come with him to Washington to turn around the minds of 6 congressmen, 6. We went from office to office, one by one. He turned them around, and we got all 6 votes. That's why there's a space station. Then later, we had to go up and talk about some medical issues, and Dr. DeBakey and Dr. LeMaitre, who's head of MD Anderson, and I went up, and we sat before a committee. And as all of you know, committees can be a little tough. But the chairman of the committee introduced Dr. DeBakey and said, "Ladies and gentlemen on the committee, sometimes you guys are a little rough, but Dr. DeBakey took care of my mother, so I want him treated with kid gloves." "Oh, of course, Dr. DeBakey, we're so glad to have you. Dr. LeMaitre and MD Anderson, what can we do for you? What would you like?" And they went through their asking. When we used to go to Austin and ask for appropriations, whoever was before the appropriations committee would be asked to step aside, so Dr. DeBakey wasn't kept from his life-saving missions too long. I mean, it was amazing. So one time, Jack Kenny Williams, who was the chancellor of the A&M system, said, "Could Dr. DeBakey make our presentation for the A&M system, please?" Thank you all.
Thank you very much.